The bitter civil wars that raged in 15th century England are known to history by the emblems of the two rival factions in the House of Plantagenet, the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster. For more than 30 years, these deadly rivals were locked into a struggle for power, a struggle that would witness slaughter amongst the greatest families in England, the death of princes and kings, the struggle that would eventually lead to the bloody field of Bosworth. There, the blood-stained crown of England would be claimed by Henry Tudor, and a new, strong dynasty would emerge from the maelstrom of the Wars of the Roses.
If you ask most people what medieval is, they will often think of something to do with the Wars of the Roses. And I think it's bestowed upon the later Middle Ages a sense that this was a period of disorder, of clashing magnates thrashing around in the mud, trying to seize the throne from the poor old king.
The 15th century has more violent changes of ruler than any other century since the Norman conquest.
Our image today of the Wars of the Roses is likely to be one of incessant warfare, of nobles only too keen to pick up a sword and charge off to the next battle.
The origins of the Wars of the Roses can be traced back to the previous century and the 100 Years' War between England and France. The conflict burst into life in 1337 during the reign of Edward III, but it was, in fact, little more than an escalation of a conflict that had preoccupied kings of England for generations. With the French monarchy's ever-increasing strength and confidence, it was predictable that the King of England's position as one of France's chief landholders would come under threat.
The 100 Years' War is a war between the English and French for control of France, and it lasts really actually for several hundred years rather than a single 100 years. But it leaves the English king with a series of claims to territory in France and also a claim to the French throne. And what Henry V does in the 1410s is powerfully revive these English claims and lead a very successful conquest of the whole of Normandy in alliance with the Duke of Burgundy.
Clearly, leadership was a key to success in the 100 Years' War. And Henry V was a military genius, facing Charles VI of France, who was mentally unstable. The fact that Charles believed he was made of glass really wasn't an advantage on the battlefield. And over the next few years, Henry launched a series of sieges which effectively took control of France, and he was able to force upon the French a treaty which disinherited the French heir, and it meant that Henry and his own heirs would become the kings of France after Charles VI's death. That was complete victory.
The treaty, which confirmed the English king's succession to the throne of France, was signed at Troyes in 1420. With the elderly Charles VI of France the only barrier to Henry V's acquisition of the French title, England's territorial gains in France seemed assured. The premature death of Henry in 1422, probably from dysentery, fundamentally changed England's position. The realm was unprepared for his sudden loss, and the late king's infant son was promptly pronounced Henry VI, inheriting the English crown at the age of only 9 months. It was a distinctly uneasy inheritance. For just 2 months later, Henry's maternal grandfather, Charles VI of France, also died, leaving the child sole monarch of the 2 great kingdoms.
Clearly, the death of Henry V was potentially a very serious blow to the ability of the English really to make good the claim to the French throne. The only king who was likely to make good the claim to the whole of France would have been Henry V. And I suppose Henry VI's claim is just as good as he was able to make it militarily. The claim really rested in the Treaty of Troyes and the question of whether the English could make that stick.
But the reality was that Henry's claim depended solely on success on the battlefield. If the English were defeated and pushed back across the Channel, then Henry's claim simply wasn't worth the parchment it was written on.
Fortunately for the new king, the war in France continued successfully under the leadership of Henry VI's uncle, John, Duke of Bedford. Meanwhile, in England, it would not have been a surprise, given the uncertain times and Henry VI's tender age, if someone had challenged his succession. But this was not the case, and during the king's minority, a council of men from the chief noble houses ruled England and France. Among these were Henry's uncle Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, and his great-uncle Henry Beaufort, the Bishop of Winchester. These men, able advisers as they were to the king, were hardly the best of friends.
The disputes between Gloucester and Beaufort seemed to dominate the first 20 years of Henry VI's reign. I mean, there was one occasion when their supporters turned up at Parliament with clubs and staves hidden under their clothing, just in case they needed them for self-defence. The origins of their disputes really lie in a personal dispute for power and disputes over policy.
Gloucester thinks that he should be protector of England rather than there being this minority council which has been set up in the teeth of his opposition. So a lot of his attacks in the 1420s on Beaufort are really attacks against the council and an insistence that he should have a more powerful kind of protectorate. Gloucester is an enthusiastic exponent of aggressive military action in France. He's watching Bedford, and whenever he thinks Bedford isn't doing enough, he comes forward with his own proposals for a more aggressive prosecution of the war. Whereas Beaufort is thinking more in terms of a mixture of truces, possibilities of peace negotiation, and support to the Duke of Bedford.
In France, however, things started to go badly wrong for the English. Although they scored victories at Cravant in 1423 and at Verneuil in 1424, they could not possibly have reckoned on the arrival of Joan of Arc at the Siege of Orleans in 1429. It was a pivotal moment. The extraordinary peasant girl inspired the revival in the fortunes of the French, a revival that resulted in the crowning of the Dauphin at Rheims. With the subsequent loss of their vital Burgundian allies, Henry VI's early reign was dominated by the increasingly disastrous course of the 100 Years' War. Not only had Henry to contend with events in France, looming over him throughout his reign was the issue of Lancastrian legitimacy and the competing claim to the throne of the Duke of York. As usual, during these turbulent times, little was clear or cut and dried, and the responsibility for this can be laid squarely at the feet of John of Gaunt, Earl of Lancaster, the third surviving son of King Edward III, from whom Henry VI was descended.
John of Gaunt, a very powerful man, married by the king first of all to the heiress of the House of Lancaster, so the huge estates of the Duchy of Lancaster are brought within the royal orbit by Gaunt's marriage, and then later married off by the king to the heiress of the throne of Castile. He's an early illustration, actually, of the difficulties of fitting into the English polity these great members of the royal family who own huge estates, who are too big men, really, to fit under not very competent kings.
It seems harsh to blame John of Gaunt and Edward III for the fact that they had too many children. But in the 1450s, there were just far too many people at the royal court who had royal blood pumping around their veins.
History Hit is an award-winning streaming platform built by history fans for history fans. Enjoy our rich library of documentaries covering key events and locations of the medieval period. History Hit's medieval offering features leading historians such as Dan Jones, Eleanor Janega and Kat Jarman. Not only that, but we've a rich library of audio documentaries covering every period of history through our network of podcasts. Sign up now for a free trial, and Chronicle fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code Chronicle at checkout.
After the death of Edward III's eldest son and heir, the Black Prince, Edward named his grandson Richard as his successor, and upon Edward's death, he became king, ruling as Richard II. Only 11 years of age when he came to the throne, Richard's reign was marked by turmoil, and it ended when, in 1399, he was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, John of Gaunt's son. Henry was crowned Henry IV in that year, and in 1400, Richard was murdered at Pontefract Castle. The death of the childless Richard was most convenient for Henry, for now the direct line of descendancy from the Black Prince, Edward III's eldest son, was ended, making Henry's position that much stronger. It was through Henry IV and his son, Henry V, that King Henry VI drew his own claim to the throne. But Henry was not the only descendant of Edward III with a claim. Through Edmund Langley, one of Edward's other sons, came the candidate from the House of York. Edmund was the grandfather of Richard, Duke of York, Henry VI's cousin, and the great-grandson of King Edward III. He was, therefore, a generation closer to Edward III than the young king himself. He also had a further claim through the female line, descending from Edward III's second son, Clarence.
If you admit that the crown of England can go through women, then Richard II's nearest heir was not Henry of Lancaster, but a descendant of Lionel of Clarence's daughter, Philippa, Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March. In 1399, Mortimer was a child and easily, therefore, overlooked, but the Mortimer claim was not to go away.
In practice, it was unlikely that York was going to claim the throne. After all, the nobility supported Henry VI. Now, York was only ever likely to put forward his claim if something disastrous happened, if he was pushed into challenging Henry.
Henry VI's minority came to an end in 1436 when the king was 15. Unhappily, Henry was to prove a weak monarch, and a man utterly unsuited for these troubled times. He was sensitive, pious, and scholarly. John Blackman, a monk with a personal knowledge of King Henry's court, recorded that
the king was travelling through Cripplegate, and he saw over the gate there the quarter of a man on a tall stake, and asked what it was. When told it was the quarter of a traitor who had been false to the king's majesty, he said, "Take it away. I will not have any Christian man so cruelly handled for my sake." And the quarter was moved immediately.
Henry VI is a difficult man for us to know much about because he's been coloured in all sorts of different ways. Some have presented him at the time and subsequently as more or less an idiot. Others have presented him as a very pious and saintly figure. And quite often, actually, we find in history fairly idiotic, fairly weak and feeble kings get written up as if they are saintly or monk-like. So whenever we see Henry called by those kinds of terms, I think we might smell the rat of somebody pretty incompetent.
If you actually look at what happened to the realm under Henry, rather than going over and over what his character might or might not have been, what you actually see is a complete emptiness at the centre, where you should have the king and the king's will on which the realm depended, that the king would act and would act positively to make his government work. There seems to be a complete void. The great historian of this period, K.B. Macfarlane, said that Henry VI went from first to second childhood without the usual interval, and that really sums it up quite nicely.
Fearful that Henry's weakness would cause irreparable damage to the country, the powerful figures from the ruling council of his minority continued to govern the country. King Henry was a ripe target for a growing circle of avaricious ministers and greedy nobles. Now, the unstable Henry began to bestow honours and lands upon his favourites, quickly draining the healthy coffers left by his father and creating resentment against those nobles who gained most from Henry's favour. Chief amongst them was the Duke of Suffolk.
Suffolk is a very interesting figure in many ways, often treated as something like the villain of the piece, though in my own view Suffolk is something of a civil servant hero, actually. He has a respectable military career in the 1410s and 20s, respectable rather than spectacular, but he's a useful right-hand man for the Duke of Bedford. Finds a place on the minority council and also gets put into the royal household as steward of the royal household. And it's that joint position in the household and on the council that gives Suffolk the capacity to move to the head of affairs, really, in the course of the 1430s and become the very dominant figure in the 1440s that he is. So Suffolk is an important manager of royal authority and an important cause of the relative calm of the 1430s and 1440s, calm which is pretty remarkable given the fact that the king is not himself ruling effectively.
The king's spendthrift handling of the nation's fortune and his weak grasp of administration was already causing serious discontent amongst the members of the former council. But it was his arbitrary redistribution of wealth and power and his creation of so many newly empowered lords with their own bands of retainers that led to an eruption of infighting over land, property rights and inheritance. It was a dangerous time for the established nobles, whose previously stable position was placed in jeopardy by the arrival of these ambitious newcomers. In 1445, Henry VI married the 15-year-old Margaret of Anjou, a princess from Valois, who would soon grow into a woman to be reckoned with.
Henry VI's wife, Margaret of Anjou, from the outset, in English eyes, had two major disadvantages. One is that she was foreign, and specifically French, who were regarded, of course, as the ancient enemy. And the other was that her marriage to Henry brought the country no financial advantage. On the contrary, the marriage and the attendant festivities were extremely expensive, and since Henry's reign by this time was virtually bankrupt, this was not a good start.
The marriage between Henry and Margaret, the King of France's niece, was part of a treaty agreed with the French at Tours in 1444 by de la Pole, the Duke of Suffolk. The Duke of Gloucester was mortified. War was the only way in which the country would regain what was hers, he argued. Gloucester was swiftly silenced, and his hawkish views saw him isolated from the rest of the royal household. With the support of the Queen, de la Pole had Gloucester arrested for treason in 1447. Although he needn't have bothered. Gloucester died in distinctly mysterious circumstances soon after. His death, therefore, made him one of the few members of the royal household exempt from responsibility for the political disasters that followed, and the Duke of Gloucester would later become something of an icon for the Yorkist cause.
Gloucester is almost certainly murdered. Some chroniclers say that he's murdered with a red-hot spit in the fundament. Other chroniclers say that he's pressed to death between feather beds. But what these are attempts to explain a murder that leaves no obvious mark on the publicly displayed parts of a body.
The story that Gloucester had been murdered swiftly spread, along with the myth of the good Duke of Gloucester, the man who'd stood valiantly against a clique of ambitious courtiers, the man who'd defended the reputation, the legacy of his brother Henry V. Unfortunately for that myth, we now know that actually it was Gloucester who was politically isolated. The rest of the nobility were behind Suffolk, even the Duke of York, who was the one who made the most use of the Gloucester myth in later years.
England's hold on France had loosened even further as the result of a massive error of judgment by Henry. Richard, Duke of York, despite his impressive military record fighting the French, was sent to Ireland as Lord Lieutenant. Henry transferred the role of English commander in France to his inept favourite and York's great rival, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Somerset was yet another noble with a distant claim to the throne owing to his relationship to John of Gaunt. In Somerset's case, through Gaunt's third wife, Catherine Swynford, and the Beaufort line. The Beauforts were the illegitimate offspring of Gaunt, who had been legitimised by Henry IV on condition that they would not lay claim to the crown. This piece of legislation could easily be reversed, and with Henry VI still childless and Somerset in favour, York's position as heir apparent might not be guaranteed.
There is no evidence at all of serious hostility between York and either Somerset or his forebears before 1450. I don't think we should take terribly seriously any sense that York felt hostile to the Beauforts because they had a potential claim to the throne which might be exercised if Henry VI was to die without heirs, because nobody seems to have been taking the Beaufort claim to the throne seriously at that point.
Although personal hostility is likely to have been a part of their relations, we need to see these people as politicians representing alternative solutions to England's problems, and indeed representing quite large bodies of opinion and quite large bodies of politicians themselves. It's not just a personal conflict, it's also a public conflict.
The Duke of Somerset was simply no soldier or military leader, and it was perhaps no great surprise that more English territory in France was lost under his command. Matters were swiftly coming to a head, and Henry's mismanagement of affairs in both countries now gave birth to a real domestic crisis. In 1449, a parliament was summoned to investigate the parlous state of affairs. The English people demanded to know why the war with France, which had cost them so dearly in taxes, had been so disastrously mismanaged. Increasing instances of abuses of the law, particularly by the newly established feudal lords and their retainers, was also causing enormous public outcry. Blame had to be apportioned somewhere, and it was the Duke of Suffolk who provided an attractively high-profile scapegoat for the ills of the country. The Parliament blamed Suffolk for the catastrophic loss of France, and in 1450, he was formally impeached. Suffolk was accused of having made a treacherous peace with France under the influence of Henry's French queen, and of surrendering the territories of Anjou and Maine. Sent into exile by the king for his own safety, Suffolk was waylaid en route to France and was murdered at sea. summarily executed with a rusty sword. It seemed that ordinary people throughout the land were looking to the Duke of York for salvation. Posted in Ireland, York was, at least, blameless for the fresh French disasters of 1450, news of which mortified the kingdom. Normandy had been lost. Few can have been unaware that it was the loss of this important duchy that had spurred King John's barons into revolt over 200 years before. The summer of 1450 saw the simmering discontent among the people of England at last boil over, and the country burst into open rebellion. At the head of the revolt was an Irishman named Jack Cade.
We don't know a great deal about who Jack Cade was. The government, first of all, thought that he was called John Mortimer, and Mortimer, of course, is this very charged name. It's the name of the family from whom Richard of York gets his claim to the throne which is better than the Lancastrian claim to the throne. When they put it about that he was an Irishman, they may again have been alluding to this Mortimer connection, because York was a great Irish landowner, and one of the things the government tries to do in the early 1450s is to suggest that York was behind the Cade Rebellion.
One of Cade's pseudonyms was John Amend-all. John put everything right, and really that sums up the situation in England in early 1450. Anything that could go wrong was going wrong. The English were being pushed rapidly out of Normandy, and English refugees were traipsing back through London, clutching their few belongings. And this was a pitiful sight to onlookers and simply stirred up more anger at the politicians. And then there were economic problems. The cloth and wool trade across the south of England was struggling, leading to unemployment and falling wages. And then disorder was breaking out. One of the king's leading councillors, Bishop Mullanes, was murdered in Portsmouth by sailors who hadn't been paid wages. Suffolk himself had been murdered despite the fact that he had the king's safe conduct. And yet another councillor, the king's chaplain, Bishop Ayscough, was shortly to be murdered in his own diocese. The country appeared to be falling apart.
The demands of the rebels were issued by Cade in a proclamation of grievances, a document that survives to this day.
These be the points, cause, and mischiefs of gathering and assembling of us, the king's liege men of Kent. We say our sovereign lord may understand that his false counsel has lost its law, his merchandise is lost, his common people is destroyed, the sea is lost, France is lost. The king himself is so set that he may not pay for his meat nor drink, and he owes more than ever any king of England ought, for daily his traitors about him, where anything should come to him by his laws, anon they take it from him. His true commons desire that he will remove from him all the false progeny and affinity of the Duke of Suffolk, and to take about his noble person his true blood of his royal realm, that is to say, the high and mighty Prince the Duke of York, exiled from our sovereign lord's person by the noising of the false traitor, the Duke of Suffolk, and his affinity.
If Cade's demands were couched in the language of reason, the lengths to which he was prepared to go to achieve them were not. The uprising became increasingly violent. Cade's rebels occupied the Guildhall in London and freed the prisoners in the Marshalsea and King's Bench jails. They looted private houses and shops to the terror of the London merchants who had suffered enough from the recent demise in foreign trade. Finally, Cade's men besieged the Tower of London itself and dragged Lord Say, the king's treasurer, out from within its walls. The unfortunate Say was murdered along with William Cromer, the Sheriff of Kent. It was recorded that
they took Say to Cheapside, and there smote off his head. The same day Cromer was beheaded in Mile End. Afterwards, they brought their heads on poles and placed their heads together, making them seem to kiss each other.
Initially, there was great support for the demands of Cades rebels. People sympathised with their objectives. There were even those in the king's army who sympathised, and that forced the king to leave London and retreat. But once the rebels were in London, once they'd embarked upon their looting and executions, then the tide turned against them. The Londoners brought together their own force, and in a pitched midnight battle, presumably fought by torchlight along London Bridge, they kicked out the rebels, slamming the gates on them with great relief. And it was the Londoners who put an end to Cades Rebellion, not the king.
With the rebels ousted from London, the revolt was finally ended by royal promises of reforms and free pardons, which, probably to no one's great surprise, turned out to be false. Jack Cade, the architect of the outbreak of public anarchy, attempted to escape to the south coast, but he was hunted down and killed during a skirmish in a garden near Heathfield in Sussex. Cades Rebellion turned out to be a major scare for the government of England and a damning indictment of the king's rule. With Suffolk gone and the king as incompetent as ever, a new councillor-in-chief was needed. The MPs of the Commons echoed Cades' rebels and called for the Duke of York to return to England and deal with the troubles of the realm. York delayed and remained in Ireland, possibly trying to distance himself from the recent revolt. Somerset seized his chance.
Somerset, having been in command when Normandy is lost, came back, found the court in disarray, the attack on Suffolk, the country in disarray, picked up the pieces and got some kind of semblance of government going. Meantime, York came back from Ireland and decided that he was the person who would sort the country out. So what you have here are two very prominent nobles, both closely related to the king, both potentially, if they wanted to push it, with a claim to the throne, each claiming that he was the one to rule the country. And from that point onwards, neither of them could back down.
York clearly hoped to establish himself as Henry's principal counsellor in the wake of Cades Rebellion, but he left it too late. By the time he returned from Ireland in the autumn of 1450, the role had been filled by Somerset. York may have had popular support, in London at least, but he had little amongst the nobility. In the wake of Cades Rebellion, the nobility wished to put loyalty and unity first, and it was York who appeared to be threatening that unity.
The winter of 1450 witnessed the Duke of York's attempts to remove the king's advisors. York clearly blamed Somerset for the disasters in France. Normandy had been lost, mainly because of flawed military planning and a feeble response to the French uprisings. By calling for administrative and financial reform, York started to gain popularity amongst MPs, and he publicly vowed to avenge the losses in France. York soon had to curb his accusations, however, as Somerset enjoyed the king's support and his claims seemed to be verging on treason. Somerset was, for the moment at least, secure in his position as Henry's councillor-in-chief. Without the support of the nobles, York would have to bide his time.
What begins to emerge in some ways in the early 1450s is two radically different approaches to the problem of order in Henry VI's England. On the one hand, there is York and the MPs and the Commons who are calling for justice upon the traitors, restoration of royal finances, restoration of noble counsel around the king. On the other hand, there is the Duke of Somerset, who basically says, if we could just deal with all these rebels and troublemakers, everything would be okay. The king is capable of ruling, the king is well advised within his household. So we have a situation in which York and Somerset are sworn to deal with one another, in a sense. The position that each man is striking requires him to get rid of the other.
In August 1451, Somerset returned to England from his disastrous stewardship of France. Only 2 months previously, Bordeaux had fallen, and after 300 years in English possession, Gascony had been lost. To the Duke of York, the situation looked bleak. Over the last year, he had failed in his attempts to remove Somerset, and the public support for his position after Cades Rebellion was beginning to fade. For York, the loss of France was the final straw. Something must be done. In February 1452, after deciding that force might succeed where diplomacy had failed, Richard, Duke of York, put himself at the head of an open rebellion.
York took an army right across the country down into Kent to threaten the king and hopefully remove Somerset from power. But he simply didn't have enough support. There were only 2 nobles on his side. The rest stood resolutely behind the king, even the Nevilles, who in a short time were going to be York's allies.
York doesn't get the big burst of popular support that he may have been counting on, and then he stops looking like a popular leader, the man of the common weal, and begins to look rather more like a shabby magnate trying to rouse the rabble to support his own policy. So York is really thoroughly defeated.
York had behaved rashly in 1452, and the result was that he was now politically isolated. Nobody wanted to ally with him for fear of the taint of treason being attached to them.
After the failure of the rebellion, the Duke of York was released, but only after having suffered the humiliation of being made to swear an oath of loyalty to the king at St. Paul's in London. Despite his best efforts, both diplomatic and military, the Duke was no nearer achieving his aims, and the experience seems to have exhausted him. For the next year and a half he laid low, a brooding presence on the sidelines of English politics. The tensions between the Dukes of York and Somerset had now escalated to the point that the court and nobility were dividing into 2 very hostile and rival factions. The quarrelsome nobles, such as the Percys who lived here at Warkworth Castle in Northumberland, needed an overmighty ruler to keep them in check. As King Henry was failing to provide this authority, warring lords were siding with the 2 rival dukes in the hope of gaining advantage in decisions on their disputes, once Somerset or York had control of the king. Somerset enjoyed the support of Queen Margaret and Henry's Lancastrian supporters. York's camp was joined by the powerful Neville family from the north of England, headed by the influential Earls of Warwick and Salisbury. Warwick hated the Duke of Somerset, while the entire family had a long-standing feud with the indomitable Percy family, the Earls of Northumberland. As a result of these bitter rivalries, the Percys sided with Somerset and the Lancastrians against York. Baronial power struggles had begun to dominate the nation's agenda, and they were to have disastrous consequences.
The Nevilles and the Percys are the 2 most powerful families of northern England, really. And of the 2 in the Lancastrian period, the Nevilles are the more powerful family. The Nevilles have their estates in North Yorkshire and towards the western side of the very far north of England. They're more powerful in this period than the Percys because they're married into the royal family, and because the Percys, having assisted Henry IV's usurpation of the throne in 1399, then rose up against the king in 1403 and 1405 and consequently suffered confiscation of their estates. The Percys, who are the Earls of Northumberland and have major landholdings on the eastern side of the northern border with Scotland, have won their way back to a degree of acceptance, particularly under Henry V, but they're slightly the second-rank family.
There was no major sign of hostility between the families until the summer of 1453, and then it was a wedding, as it so often is with families, that caused the trouble. Thanks to this marriage, the Nevilles were about to gain control of lands which formerly had been Percy territory. This seems to have set off Lord Egremont, a younger son of the Percy family, and he attacked the wedding party on its return home. This piece of private warfare began the hostility between the Nevilles and the Percys that came to dominate so much of the Civil War over the succeeding years.
While local feuds and lawlessness spread throughout England, on the other side of the Channel there was a sudden upswing in English fortunes. Bordeaux was recaptured, and the news came that the Queen was expecting her first child. But as so often in the saga of the Wars of the Roses, good news was soon followed by bad tidings. In July 1453, the English were overwhelmed and defeated at the Battle of Castillon in Gascony. Bordeaux fell a second time into French hands, this time for good, and the 100 Years' War effectively drew to a close. For England, it was a deeply ignominious end to a conflict that had seen the highs of Crécy and Agincourt, and in August, the king became insane.
Henry's madness may have been brought about by learning of the massive defeat at Castillon in Gascony. But in fact, immediately beforehand, we get the closest to active ruling that you find from the adult Henry VI. This looks to me very much like Somerset taking the king around the country to make it look like active ruling. But whichever it was, it seems completely to have worn him out and finished him off.
He falls into a kind of stupor. He can't move, he can't speak, he has to be carried around. Somerset decides to keep on business as usual, to behave as if the king is absolutely fine. But it doesn't work this time, because the king is well and truly mad. He's not just uninterested in government. And with near warfare breaking out in the north of England, something really has to be done to restore the situation. The government has to come clean about the king's illness. It has to gather together the nobility to try and find some kind of platform for a new form of rule. And that means calling York back in. It's a middle-of-the-road group of councillors who, in the teeth of resistance from Somerset and probably from the Lord Chancellor, Cardinal Kemp, summon York to attend a council. And York attends that council with every intention, it seems, of taking control.
In October 1453, Queen Margaret gave birth to a son, Edward, at last providing a direct heir to the throne. The new baby became the focal point of Margaret's life, and she began to channel her considerable energy into ensuring that the child received what was his by birthright, the succession to the throne. She became even more suspicious of the Duke of York, who, after all, would still be heir should any misfortune befall the young Edward. Meanwhile, in November 1453, Somerset's politicking and ruthless accumulation of wealth caught up with him. He was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower. One of the many men he had crossed was the Earl of Warwick, later to become famous as Warwick the Kingmaker. For Somerset, falling out with Warwick had been a particularly bad move.
One reason why York is able to get his way on getting rid of Somerset is not only the fact that the Lords, I think, have lost confidence in Somerset's capacity to run the show, but also the hostility of the Nevilles towards Somerset, part of which seems to relate to Somerset's attempt to gain control of the Lordship of Glamorgan in South Wales, which is regarded by the Earl of Warwick as his own property and his own sphere of interest.
The Neville's support for York against Somerset was a classic case of my enemy's enemy is my friend. York's newfound power gave the Nevilles the chance to win their own battles, firstly against Somerset and also against the Percys.
Even from within the confines of the Tower, Somerset continued to plot, adding to the atmosphere of tension and uncertainty at court. In March 1454, the council reluctantly appointed York as protector, and for the following 9 months he ruled England as king in all but name.
As protector, York is in many ways quite effective, actually. He delivers somewhat biased justice in the north of England, mainly in favour of the Nevilles and against the interests of the Percys, but in doing that he's fairly typical of the way the north has been ruled in the past. And this means that when the king recovers at Christmas 1454, there is some uncertainty among the lords about whether to swing back to the rule of Somerset and the royal household and the Queen around the king. There's quite a lot more sympathy, I think, for York and the Nevilles, although their bitter enemies, the Percys, are probably calling for action against them behind the scenes.
Historians have often agreed that if Henry's madness was a tragedy, his recovery was a national disaster. The king summarily dismissed York as protector and immediately released Somerset from the Tower, making civil war almost inevitable.
York and the Nevilles clearly felt on the defensive. A great council was summoned to Leicester, which is in the heart of the old Duchy of Lancaster lands, in May. And one would guess that York and the Nevilles had in mind what, for example, had happened to Gloucester at the Bury Parliament in 1447. So they decided that they would come armed to this council. And as they came from the north, so they met Henry and his forces coming up towards the council from London, and they met at St Albans. Negotiations ensued, rather as it occurred at Dartford, but this time York was not going to be tricked, so it did not end with York laying down his arms and ended in battle.
And so, on May the 2nd, 1455, the first real battle of the Wars of the Roses began. Inside the town of St Albans, King Henry VI and his household waited as the Lancastrian army fought to hold off the attacks by the Yorkist forces. At first all went well as the Yorkist troops struggled to break through the narrow streets. Tightly packed together, they were easy prey for the Lancastrian archers. It was the Earl of Warwick who, seeing the futility of further attacks through the lanes, signalled a change of tactics and made an assault through the back of the houses. Very soon, the Yorkists had broken into the marketplace, and there was total panic in the royal household. Henry himself sustained a wound in the neck as the Yorkist arrows rained down, and he was forced to shelter in a tanner's cottage. The Yorkists had won an important victory. But what of the Duke of Somerset, holed up in the Castle Inn? How must he have felt as he heard the Yorkists batter down its doors? Knowing the fate that awaited him if he surrendered to his arch-enemy York, Somerset decided to go down fighting. Flailing wildly with his sword as Yorkist soldiers surrounded him, he is supposed to have killed 4 men before he was hacked to death. The Battle of St Albans may have been little more than a skirmish when compared to the slaughter to come. Perhaps 100 men, mostly Lancastrians, lost their lives. But 3 important nobles, the Duke of Somerset, the Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Clifford, had all been killed, signifying without question that in the coming war no quarter would be asked or given. Henry was made a prisoner of the Duke of York. With his arch-rival, the Duke of Somerset, dead, the kingdom lay within York's grasp, and everything depended upon how he played his next move. And although many hoped the crisis in royal government had finally been resolved, 30 years of bitterness, rancour, and bloodshed lay ahead for England.